Hello? I should have been suspicious when she left the house dressed like that, heels too high for a regular day at work, perfume a little too strong, and that glimmer of excitement in her eyes she used to reserve for our date nights. Rachel, my wife, had been acting strange for weeks, but I chalked it up to stress. We all carry burdens, and I didn't want to be the paranoid husband. Her usual goodbye kiss felt rushed that morning. I have to go out of town for a work thing. I'll be back late, she said, avoiding eye contact. The pit in my stomach churned, but I forced a smile. Drive safe, I muttered. That night, I was alone in our too-quiet house. I thought about calling her, but the fear of seeming clingy stopped me. Then came the knock at the door, sharp, hurried, almost panicked. When I opened it, I found myself staring at Jenny, our next-door neighbor. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. I need to talk to you, she stammered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Jenny's husband, Greg, and I weren't best friends, but we were friendly enough, barbecues, beers in the backyard, casual nods when we crossed paths. Jenny herself was a sweet woman, always polite and kind to Rachel and me. Seeing her like this, so frazzled, was unsettling. What's wrong? I asked, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated before stepping into the foyer, wringing her hands. It's about Rachel and Greg. Her words hit like a sledgehammer, knocking the air out of my lungs. What about them? I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Jenny looked down, her eyes filling with tears. They've been meeting. When you think they're at work or out of town, they're together. I'm sorry, I didn't know how else to tell you. For a moment I couldn't move. The room tilted, the walls closing in. Rachel? My Rachel? The woman I'd loved for years, the mother of our kids, sneaking around with Greg? Are you sure? I finally managed, my voice cold, mechanical. Jenny nodded. I followed Greg today. He met her at a motel, an hour outside of town. The words hung heavy in the air, suffocating. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a cruel misunderstanding. But deep down I knew. The late nights, the hushed phone calls, the sudden work trips, it all made sense now. Jenny handed me her phone. On the screen were photos, grainy but damning. Rachel and Greg, laughing together as they walked into a cheap motel, their hands brushing against each other like teenagers sneaking around for the first time. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice tinged with suspicion. Jenny looked at me, her eyes filled with anguish. Because I can't take it anymore. I deserve better. And so do you. Her words lit a fire in me. For weeks, I'd felt like something was off, like Rachel was slipping through my fingers. But this wasn't just slipping, this was betrayal. I thanked Jenny and closed the door behind her, my mind already spiraling. The evidence was there. Rachel wasn't working late. She wasn't out of town for a meeting. She was with him. I poured myself a drink and sat in the dark, gripping the glass so tightly my knuckles turned white. Rage simmered beneath the surface, but I didn't let it boil over. Not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, I needed a plan. And when Rachel came home that night, smiling as if nothing had happened, I realized just how cold my revenge would be. Rachel walked through the door a little after midnight, her hair slightly tousled, the faint scent of wine clinging to her. She smiled as though she'd come home from a harmless work dinner, not a sordid motel rendezvous. Long day, she said, dropping her purse by the door. The client meeting went over. Then traffic was insane. I nodded, watching her intently, trying to memorize every detail of her lie. The way her lips curved when she spoke, the practiced nonchalance in her tone, it all felt rehearsed. My chest burned, but I kept my expression neutral. If she noticed how stiff my smile was, she didn't let on. Yeah, traffic can be brutal, I said, forcing a chuckle. You must be exhausted. She blinked, surprised by my calmness, as if she'd expected suspicion. Maybe she wanted me to accuse her so she could weave a web of denials and half-truths. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction, not yet. I'm wiped, she replied, heading toward the stairs. I'm going to shower and crash. You coming to bed? In a bit, I said, holding her gaze for a beat longer than usual. She faltered, hesitating just a fraction before nodding and disappearing up the stairs. As soon as I heard the water running, I retrieved my phone and started scrolling through her social media accounts. Rachel wasn't stupid, she'd covered her tracks well. Her messages were vague, her photos curated to show a perfect, hard-working wife. But people make mistakes. I just had to find hers. I started with the most innocuous place, her Instagram. It was filled with pictures of business meetings, coffee runs, and busy day selfies. But one post caught my eye, a snapshot from a conference last month, one I'd thought was legitimate. Rachel and Greg were in the background, barely noticeable, their heads tilted toward each other in a way that felt intimate. I enlarged the photo, staring at their expressions. I remembered that weekend vividly. I'd stayed home with the kids while she was working. Seeing her there, laughing with him, I felt the bile rise in my throat. The sound of the shower stopped. I put my phone away and stared into my drink, letting the anger settle into something cold and manageable. There was no use confronting her tonight. She'd deny it. She'd twist the story. And I wanted her to think she'd gotten away with it. The next morning, Rachel was back to her usual self, cheery, affectionate, humming as she made coffee. It was sickening how easily she slipped back into her role, like last night hadn't happened. Do you have plans tonight? She asked, handing me a cup of coffee. I shook my head. Nothing special. Why? I thought we could have a date night. It's been a while since we've had some us time. The audacity of her suggestion made my jaw clench. A date night? After sneaking around with Greg? I forced a smile. Sure, sounds great. Her eyes lit up, and for a moment, I wondered if she believed her own act. Did she think she was still the woman I'd fallen in love with? Or was this just another way to cover her tracks? After breakfast, I kissed her goodbye and left for work, but I didn't go to the office. Instead, I drove to a nearby park and parked in a secluded spot. Jenny's words from last night echoed in my head, I deserve better. And so do you. Pulling out my phone, I scrolled through the photos Jenny had sent me after our conversation. They were damning. Rachel and Greg leaving the motel, their bodies close, their smiles too intimate for friends. My stomach twisted as I saved the photos to a hidden folder. But that wasn't enough. I needed more than blurry snapshots. I needed irrefutable proof. That afternoon, I rented a small GPS tracker. It was surprisingly easy to install, a tiny device that I slipped under Rachel's car when she wasn't looking. She'd never notice it, and I know exactly where she went, no matter what excuses she made. When Rachel left the house that evening, claiming she was meeting a friend for yoga, I stayed behind, staring at the tracker's live feed on my phone. Her car didn't head toward any yoga studio. Instead, it took a familiar route, one I recognized all too well. Greg's house. I watched the red dot on the map stop in his driveway. My grip tightened around the phone as I imagined her slipping inside, her excuses evaporating the moment the door closed behind her. It wasn't just betrayal, it was mockery. She thought I was too blind, too trusting to see what was happening. But she was wrong. And when I was done, she'd regret every lie, every secret, and every stolen moment with him. I sat in the dark, staring at the glowing dot on my phone's screen as it lingered in Greg's driveway. Every second felt like an eternity, every moment a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. My hand hovered over the keys, fighting the urge to storm over there and catch them in the act. But no, this wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. Revenge is best served cold. Rachel returned home later that evening, her hair damp and tied into a messy bun, a gym bag slung over her shoulder. She smelled faintly of soap, as if she'd taken a shower, not uncommon after yoga, but now I questioned everything. How was yoga? I asked, keeping my tone light. Good, she said with a smile, dropping her bag on the floor. Challenging but worth it. I feel amazing. She had no idea how closely I was watching her, how carefully I was cataloging every detail of her lies. Her gym bag, a prop. Her smile, a mask. She even kissed me on the cheek before heading upstairs to rest. I let her think she'd fooled me, but as soon as she was out of sight, I retrieved her gym bag. Unzipping it, I found a neatly folded towel and a bottle of water. But something was missing: her yoga mat. Rachel never forgot her mat. She'd once driven back home to retrieve it, refusing to use the communal ones at the studio. Yet tonight it was absent, her perfectly crafted story cracking at the edges. The next day, I reached out to Jenny. "Are you sure about last night?" I asked over the phone, my voice low and measured. "Yes," she replied, no hesitation. "Greg didn't come home until after midnight. I watched from the window." "And Rachel was with him the whole time?" "Yes." I'm sorry, I really am. I wish it wasn't true." Her voice trembled with guilt, but I wasn't interested in her pity. "Thanks for telling me," I said, ending the call abruptly. With each passing day, my plan began to solidify. Rachel wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. Neither was Greg. That evening, I casually mentioned I was thinking about upgrading my phone. Rachel barely looked up from hers, scrolling through Instagram like she hadn't a care in the world. "That's nice," she said absently. "I was thinking of getting one of those family tracking apps," I added, watching her reaction carefully. Her fingers paused mid-scroll. "A tracking app?" "Yeah," I said casually. "You know, so we can keep tabs on each other. In case one of us ever gets into an accident or something." Her laugh was forced, her voice just a little too light. "I don't think that's necessary. We always tell each other where we are." I smiled, my expression unreadable. "True. Just a thought." She relaxed, returning to her phone, but I'd seen enough. Rachel didn't like the idea of being tracked. That was confirmation enough. The GPS tracker didn't disappoint. Over the next week, I watched as Rachel's car followed the same patterns. Nights she claimed to be working late or meeting friends were spent parked at Greg's house or motels in neighboring towns. Each ping on my phone's screen added fuel to the fire raging inside me. I started digging deeper. Greg wasn't just cheating on Jenny, he had a history. Old stories from other neighbors, whispers about friendliness that had gone too far, began to surface. I even found a police report buried in public records, an altercation involving Greg and another husband, years before he moved into the neighborhood. He'd gotten away with it then. Not this time. One night, while Rachel was out, working late, I paid a visit to Jenny. She looked surprised to see me on her doorstep but invited me in without question. "We need to talk," I said, sitting at her kitchen table. "You said you deserve better." "I agree." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to make them pay," I said, my voice steady. "Both of them. But I'll need your help." Jenny hesitated, glancing toward the staircase as if Greg might appear at any moment. "What do you have in mind?" she asked finally. "Proof," I said. "Something that neither of them can deny. Something that will destroy them." Over the next few days, Jenny and I worked together. She planted a small recording device in Greg's car, hidden beneath the driver's seat. It was a risk, but one she was willing to take. Meanwhile, I continued monitoring Rachel's movements, piecing together their patterns, their routines. The device captured everything, every whispered conversation, every filthy promise they exchanged during their secret rendezvous. Listening to those recordings was like pouring acid into an open wound, but I endured it. Each word only strengthened my resolve. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to burn their world to the ground. And that's exactly what I intended to do. I had the recordings, the GPS logs, and the damning photos Jenny had taken. It was enough to devastate Rachel and Greg, but I wasn't going to stop there. I didn't just want to expose them. I wanted to dismantle their lives, brick by brick, until there was nothing left. The first step was to create the illusion of normalcy. If Rachel suspected I was onto her, she'd go underground, and Greg would follow suit. I couldn't let that happen. That morning, As we ate breakfast, I brought up an idea that had been simmering in my mind. "I've been thinking," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "We haven't had a proper family outing in a while. How about a weekend trip? Just the two of us." Rachel looked up, startled. "A trip?" "Yeah," I said casually, keeping my tone light. "We could head to the lake. Get away from all the stress. Just you and me." For a moment, I thought she might decline. Her face flickered with hesitation, as if she were calculating whether this trip would interfere with her rendezvous with Greg. But then she smiled. "That sounds nice," she said. "Let's do it." "Great," I said, hiding my satisfaction behind a sip of coffee. The bait was set. Over the next few days, I carefully laid the groundwork. I booked a cabin at the lake, told Rachel's family we'd be away for the weekend, and made sure to drop hints to our neighbors about the trip. Rachel seemed to relax as the weekend approached, falling back into her role as the devoted wife. But I wasn't relaxing. I was preparing. The night before we left, I installed a hidden camera in our bedroom. It was discreet, tucked into the base of a lamp. Rachel wouldn't notice it, but it had the perfect vantage point. I needed one final piece of evidence, something undeniable. I told her I'd be working late at the office to tie up loose ends before our trip, and she barely batted an eye. As I drove away, I watched her car on the GPS tracker. Sure enough, it made its usual trip to Greg's house. I returned home hours later, slipping inside quietly. Rachel was already in bed, feigning sleep as I climbed in beside her. The camera had done its job. The next morning, we packed our bags and headed to the lake. Rachel seemed cheerful, even playful, as if the trip was a fresh start. But for me, it was just the calm before the storm. At the lake, I played the doting husband. We went kayaking, grilled dinner by the water, and even shared a bottle of wine under the stars. It almost felt real, almost. But every time she smiled, every time she laughed, I felt the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. She thought she'd won. She thought I was oblivious. The next morning, I feigned an emergency. "I just got a message from work," I told her over breakfast. "They need me for a few hours. It's something I can't delegate." Rachel looked annoyed, but she nodded. "Okay, but don't be gone too long." "I won't," I promised. Instead of going to work, I drove straight to Jenny's house. She opened the door, her face pale and drawn. "It's time," I said. Jenny hesitated but stepped aside, letting me in. On her dining table were the recordings, printed emails, and photographs we'd been gathering. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. "They deserve everything that's coming to them." Together, we created a digital package, a folder containing every incriminating detail of Rachel and Greg's affair. It wasn't just for us, it was for their families, their coworkers, and anyone else who thought they were pillars of the community. We scheduled the files to be sent out the following day. When I returned to the lake, Rachel was lounging by the water, her face serene. "How was work?" she asked as I approached. "Productive," I said, smiling. She had no idea her world was about to collapse. The drive home the next day was uneventful, Rachel humming along to the radio, while I quietly counted down the hours until the files were released. And when it happened, it was glorious. Rachel's phone buzzed repeatedly as we pulled into the driveway. She frowned, scrolling through her messages, her expression shifting from confusion to panic. "What's wrong?" I asked innocently. I don't know," she stammered. Something's wrong." Her phone buzzed again, and she froze, staring at the screen. I didn't need to ask, I knew she'd just seen it. I leaned back in my seat, watching as the color drained from her face. "Is there something you want to tell me, Rachel?" I asked, my voice cold and even. Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. This was just the beginning. Rachel's hands trembled as she scrolled through her phone, her breathing shallow. I could tell she was scrambling for an explanation, her mind racing to patch the cracks that had just shattered her carefully curated facade. "What is this?" she stammered, holding up her phone. These messages, pictures, they're lies. Someone's trying to destroy me. Lies? I echoed, my voice calm but dripping with disdain. You mean the photos of you at Greg's house? The emails? Or the recordings of your cozy little rendezvous? Which one of those is a lie, Rachel? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Her phone buzzed again, the sound cutting through the suffocating silence. Answer me, I demanded, my voice rising slightly. How long has this been going on? Tears spilled down her cheeks, her defenses crumbling. Ryan, it's not what you think. I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake, I swear. A mistake? I spat, my fists clenched at my sides. Mistakes don't happen over and over again. Mistakes don't involve sneaking out for months, lying to my face, and screwing our neighbor. She reached for me, but I stepped back, the disgust in my eyes freezing her in place. Don't, I warned. You don't get to touch me. Not after this. Inside the house, Rachel frantically tried to spin the story, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to salvage what was left. It didn't mean anything, she cried, pacing the living room. It was just… I don't know. I was lonely, and Greg, he was there, and… Stop, I said, cutting her off. Do you even hear yourself? You destroyed everything we built for someone who was there? Her sobs grew louder, but I felt no pity. Instead, I felt an icy detachment, as if I were watching this scene unfold from outside my body. I trusted you, I said quietly, my voice sharp. And you didn't just betray me, you humiliated me. Rachel dropped to her knees, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. Please, Ryan, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes, anything. Just don't give up on us. The sheer audacity of her plea sent a cold laugh bubbling up from my chest. Counseling? You think a therapist can undo the months you spent sneaking around? Do you think they can erase the images burned into my mind? The lies you fed me every single day? She crumpled into a heap, her cries muffled against the carpet. But I didn't care. Her tears weren't for me, they were for herself. For the life she knew was slipping through her fingers. That evening, I left the house without saying a word. I needed space, time to clear my head, though the rage inside me was impossible to contain. I drove aimlessly, my mind replaying every moment, every smile, every kiss Rachel had given me while she was stabbing me in the back. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the sheer ease with which she'd lied, the way she'd made me feel like the paranoid one when I'd started asking questions. And Greg, the smug bastard who'd pretended to be my friend while stealing my wife. They both deserved to burn. The fallout came quickly. The email we'd sent to Rachel's and Greg's workplaces had done its job. By the time I returned home, Rachel was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at her phone. I've been suspended, she said quietly, her voice hollow. They're launching an investigation. Someone sent everything. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the fridge, grabbed a beer, and sat across from her. Greg called, she added, her tone bitter. He said his wife kicked him out. She's filing for divorce. Well, I said, leaning back in my chair, at least someone around here has some sense. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face contorted with anger. You did this, didn't you? You're the one who sent all that to my job, to Greg's wife. You've ruined me, Ryan! I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I ruined you? No, Rachel, you ruined yourself. You made the choice to cheat. You made the choice to lie. All I did was give the world a glimpse of the real you. She recoiled as if I'd slapped her, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. But I was done playing the victim. This isn't over, I added, standing. Not by a long shot. The next few days were a whirlwind. Rachel's suspension turned into a full-blown termination as more of her colleagues discovered the scandal. Greg's wife, Jenny, wasted no time filing for divorce, citing infidelity and emotional distress. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, whispers spreading like wildfire. Rachel couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of their stares, the judgment that followed her like a shadow. She tried to plead with me, to salvage what little dignity she had left, but I was unmoved. "I'll be staying at a hotel for a while," I told her one evening, packing a bag. "Don't bother calling." "Ryan, please," she begged, grabbing my arm. "Think about the kids. Think about everything we've built." I shook her off, my expression cold. "I am thinking about the kids. And the only thing I've built is a cage you turned into a joke. You can stay here, Rachel, for now. But don't expect me to come back." As I walked out the door, her sobs followed me into the night. But I didn't look back. She didn't deserve it. Staying in the hotel felt surreal, like living in someone else's life. My home, our home, was now Rachel's cage, the walls closing in on her as the reality of her actions seeped through every crack. Meanwhile, I had space to think, plan, and execute the next phase of my revenge. The emails and recordings were only the beginning. They had stripped away her professional reputation and torched the illusion of our happy marriage, but I wanted her to feel the depth of the betrayal she'd dealt me. Greg wasn't going to escape unscathed either. I started with her social circle. Rachel had always been the social butterfly, the one who hosted wine nights with the neighborhood moms and organized charity runs. She thrived on their approval. I wasn't about to let her keep it. Using a burner phone, I sent an anonymous message to the neighborhood group chat. Attached were the photos of Rachel and Greg entering the motel, along with a caption that left no room for interpretation. "Your beloved neighbors, Rachel and Greg, have been busy. While you've been trusting them with your kids and your friendship, they've been screwing behind your backs. Thought you'd want to know." It was cruel, but cruelty was the point. Within minutes, the chat exploded with reactions: shock, outrage, betrayal. "Is this real?" someone asked. "I can't believe this," another chimed in. The messages kept coming, each one a nail in the coffin of Rachel's carefully constructed image. The next day, Rachel called me, her voice shaking. "Ryan, you have to stop this," she pleaded. "The whole neighborhood is talking. The kids, they're going to hear about it." I remained silent, letting her stew in her panic. "Please," she begged. "This is destroying everything. Can't we just talk? Find a way to move past this?" Finally I spoke, my tone icy. "Did you think about the kids when you were sneaking off to meet Greg? Did you think about me?" "No, Rachel, you only thought about yourself. Now you get to live with the consequences." I hung up before she could respond. Greg wasn't faring much better. Jenny, with my help, had already secured a lawyer and filed for divorce. She wasn't pulling any punches, demanding full custody of their kids and filing an order to keep him away from their home. "You've given me everything I need," she told me one evening as we met to finalize our strategy. "The recordings, the GPS logs, they're airtight." "Good," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Make him pay for every second he stole from you." Jenny nodded, her expression hardened by weeks of betrayal. For the first time, she seemed more resolved than broken. Meanwhile, Rachel's life was unraveling at an alarming pace. Her friends stopped returning her calls, her social media accounts were flooded with comments demanding answers, and she was quickly becoming the neighborhood pariah. One evening, as I drove past our house, I saw her through the window, curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She looked small, diminished, a ghost of the woman who once thrived in that house. It should have satisfied me. But it didn't, not completely. A few days later, I decided to take things one step further. Greg had always prided himself on his reputation as a stand-up guy, a friend, a neighbor, a mentor to the younger dads in the area. But I knew his skeletons went deeper than just the affair with Rachel. With some online digging, I unearthed his past, a series of harassment complaints from a previous job, all quietly settled out of court. I compiled the documents into a neat folder and sent them to his current employer. It wasn't long before Greg found himself out of a job. I knew it was petty, but seeing him squirm, watching as his perfect life crumbled around him, was deeply satisfying. Rachel, on the other hand, had nowhere to turn. The once bubbly, confident woman who dominated every room now seemed fragile, her face drawn and pale when I dropped by the house to pick up some of my things. "You're destroying me," she said quietly, standing in the doorway as I packed a bag. "No, Rachel," I replied, not even looking at her. "You destroyed you. I'm just making sure the truth catches up." The final blow came unexpectedly. Jenny, emboldened by the evidence I'd shared, decided to confront Rachel directly. One afternoon, as I sat in my hotel room, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenny. "It's done. She knows what rock bottom looks like now." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. That night, Rachel called me again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ryan," she said, "please come home. I can't do this alone." Her desperation was palpable, but I felt nothing. "You should have thought of that," I said, "before you destroyed everything we had." And then, for the first time, I blocked her number. I wasn't just done with Rachel. I was erasing her from my life. Blocking Rachel's number was liberating. For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Her pleas, her excuses, her endless attempts to salvage what couldn't be saved, they were nothing more than noise, and I was finally free of it. But freedom came with a price. While I'd succeeded in unraveling her world, I wasn't prepared for the fallout to ripple beyond her and Greg. The neighborhood, once a close-knit community, had become a battleground of whispers and alliances. People chose sides, some quietly supporting me, others too uncomfortable to say anything. But Rachel's and Greg's reputations were beyond repair. I received a call from one of the dads at school. "I don't know what happened between you and Rachel," he said, his tone cautious, "but it's becoming difficult for the kids. The parents are talking." The mention of my children sent a pang of guilt through me. Noah and Emma hadn't asked for any of this. They didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. "I'll handle it," I said, my voice clipped. And I meant it. The next day, I took time off work to meet with their teachers and the school counselor. I explained the situation as delicately as possible, omitting the sordid details but making it clear that the kids might need extra support. "They're good kids," I said. "They just need stability right now." The counselor nodded, her eyes full of sympathy. "We'll keep an eye on them." When I picked them up from school that afternoon, Noah and Emma were quiet, their usual chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. "Daddy," Emma said as we drove home, "why are people being mean to Mommy?" Her question was a knife to the chest. "They're not being mean," I said carefully. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, and people talk about those mistakes. But that doesn't change how much we love you, okay?" She nodded, but her wide eyes told me she didn't understand. How could she? Meanwhile, Rachel's descent into despair continued. Jenny had delivered her final blow, a confrontation that left Rachel shaken and isolated. She stopped leaving the house altogether, her once vibrant social media accounts abandoned. I heard from a mutual friend that Rachel had been drinking heavily. Her attempts to reach out to her former friends met with cold indifference. "She's not doing well," the friend said, hesitating as if unsure whether to continue. "You might want to check on her." I didn't respond. Greg, on the other hand, was attempting damage control. I saw him one afternoon while I was at the park with Noah and Emma. He was sitting alone on a bench, staring at the ground, his usually confident posture replaced by a hunched, defeated slump. He didn't notice me at first, but when he did, our eyes locked. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he stood and walked toward me, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Ryan," he began, his voice low. "Can we talk?" "No," I said flatly. He flinched but pressed on. "Look, I screwed up. I know that. But I never wanted it to get this far. I'm sorry." His apology was a weak attempt to regain some shred of dignity, but it only fueled my anger. "You're sorry?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You destroyed your marriage, wrecked mine, and humiliated your wife and kids, and all you can say is sorry?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If I were you, Greg, I'd stay far away from me and my family. Do you understand? He nodded, his face pale. Without another word, he turned and walked away. That night, I found myself replaying the events of the past few weeks. The revenge, the chaos, the destruction, it had consumed me, and now I was left with the wreckage. I thought back to the way Rachel had sobbed when I'd last spoken to her, how she'd begged for another chance. Part of me wanted to feel something, pity, sorrow, regret. But there was only emptiness. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? To make her suffer, to make her understand the depth of her betrayal? But as I looked at Noah and Emma sleeping soundly in their beds, I realized something. No matter how much I'd torn Rachel and Greg apart, the collateral damage had reached my kids, too. I had won the war, but the victory felt hollow. The next morning I called my lawyer. I want to start the divorce process, I said. Are you sure? He asked. With the way things are now, you're in a strong position. You could. I'm sure, I interrupted. I don't want anything from her. I just want it done. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. It was time to move on. The divorce proceedings began quietly, almost anticlimactically. Rachel didn't contest anything, not the separation of assets, not the custody arrangement, not the house. She simply sat across from me during the meetings, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. She tried to catch my eye once, but I refused to meet her gaze. My resolve was unshaken. The only words we exchanged were through our lawyers. By the time the papers were signed, the last remnants of our marriage were just ink on a page. Life without Rachel took some adjusting. The kids noticed her absence in the house, and while I did my best to maintain a sense of normalcy, there were cracks I couldn't hide. One night, as I was tucking Noah in, he asked, "Is Mommy ever coming back?" His question caught me off guard. I paused, searching for the right words. "She's always going to be your mom," I said, stroking his hair. "But sometimes, parents can't stay together. It doesn't mean we don't love you, okay?" He nodded slowly, but the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. After I left his room, I sat alone in the dark, grappling with the weight of everything. Rachel's betrayal had cut me deeply, but the consequences had seeped into every part of my life. The kids were collateral damage in a war they hadn't signed up for. Meanwhile, Rachel was unraveling further. I heard through mutual friends that she'd left the neighborhood, moving into a small apartment on the other side of town. She wasn't working, her reputation was too tarnished, and she spent most of her days alone. Part of me felt satisfaction knowing she was suffering. But another part, a quieter, more reluctant part, wondered if I'd gone too far. One evening, while sorting through old boxes, I came across an album from our wedding. I hadn't seen it in years, and for a moment I hesitated. Opening it felt like touching a wound that hadn't fully healed. There we were, Rachel and I, beaming on the happiest day of our lives. Her smile was radiant, her eyes filled with love. Flipping through the pages, I saw the promises we'd made, the life we'd built together. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the person she'd become, or the person I'd become in the aftermath. By the time I reached the end of the album, I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. Rachel had betrayed me in ways I could never forget, but holding on to the anger wasn't helping me heal. I couldn't erase what she'd done, but I could choose how to move forward. The next morning, I called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice tentative. "Ryan? I'm not calling to get back together," I said quickly. "But I think we need to talk for the kids." There was a pause, then a quiet, "Okay." We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a park near her new apartment. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench with her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red-rimmed but hopeful. "I want to co-parent," I said, sitting beside her. "I don't want Noah and Emma to feel like they're stuck in the middle of this mess." Her lip trembled, and she nodded. "I want that too. I'll do whatever it takes." It was a small step, but it felt like the first one towards something better, for the kids, if not for us. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I established a tentative truce. We coordinated schedules, exchanged updates about the kids, and kept our interactions civil. She never brought up the past, and neither did I. Some wounds were better left untouched. As for Greg, his life had fallen apart completely. Jenny had finalized their divorce, taking full custody of their kids and most of their assets. He'd moved into a dingy apartment downtown, his job prospects bleak after the scandal I'd exposed. I saw him once, walking down the street with his head down, his shoulders hunched. He looked like a man who'd been stripped of everything. He didn't see me, and I didn't make my presence known. Slowly, life began to find a new rhythm. The kids adjusted to the new arrangement, and I focused on being the best father I could be. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Emma leaned against me and said, "I like when we're all happy, Daddy." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord. Maybe happiness wasn't something I could find by tearing others down. Maybe it was something I had to rebuild, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to try. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to resemble something close to normal. I'd moved out of the hotel and into a new house across town, a fresh start for me and the kids. It wasn't as big or as polished as our old home, but it was ours. The kids loved it, especially the small backyard where we'd set up a swing set. It wasn't long before laughter filled the air again, a sound I hadn't realized how much I'd missed. Rachel, to her credit, stuck to our co-parenting arrangement. She never pushed boundaries, never tried to rekindle what we had. Our interactions were polite but distant, like business partners forced to work together. One evening, after dropping the kids off at my place, she lingered on the porch. "Ryan," she said, her voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say, thank you for giving me a chance to be in their lives." I didn't respond immediately. Part of me still bristled at the sight of her, the memory of her betrayal never far from my mind. But another part, the part that had started to heal, acknowledged her effort. "They're our kids," I said finally. "They deserve both of us." She nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. For a brief moment, it felt like we understood each other, like the bitterness that had defined us was beginning to fade. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could untangle the mess of emotions that still lingered. Anger, sadness, betrayal, they all had their place, but they didn't have to define me. "You've been through a lot," my therapist said one session. "But moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning how to live with the scars." Her words stayed with me. Work became a refuge, a place where I could channel my energy into something productive. My colleagues, who'd given me space during the worst of it, welcomed me back with open arms. "You look better," one of them remarked over lunch. "Feel better," I admitted, surprised at how true it felt. One evening, I received a message from Jenny. "How are you holding up?" I hadn't spoken to her much since the fallout. After Greg had moved out, she'd thrown herself into her own fresh start, focusing on her kids and her career. "Better," I replied. "You?" Her response came quickly. "Same. Let's catch up soon." It was an innocent suggestion, but it sparked something unexpected. When we met for coffee a few days later, it felt natural. Jenny looked lighter, her smile more genuine than it had been during the chaos. "I wanted to thank you," she said, stirring her latte, "for everything. I don't think I could have gotten through it without your help." I smiled. "You didn't need my help. You've always been stronger than you think." Her cheeks flushed, and for a moment, we sat in comfortable silence. The conversation flowed easily, and by the time we parted ways, I realized how much I'd missed genuine connection. Jenny understood my pain in a way few others could, and being around her felt easy. I didn't know what it meant, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. Rachel noticed the shift, though she didn't comment on it. "You seem happier," she said one afternoon as we exchanged custody of the kids. "I am," I said simply. She nodded, her expression bittersweet. "That's good. You deserve it." It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a quiet acknowledgement that we were both moving forward in our own ways. That weekend, as I sat on the porch watching Noah and Emma play, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the revenge, the destruction, it had all been necessary, but it didn't define me anymore. The scars were still there, but they no longer felt raw. They were a reminder of what I'd endured and what I'd overcome. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was ready to embrace it. And for now, that was enough. Months passed, and the pain that once consumed me felt like a distant echo. Life had found its rhythm again, a mix of school drop-offs, work deadlines, and weekend adventures with the kids. Rachel remained a steady presence in Noah and Emma's lives, but our interactions stayed cordial and distant. There were no more tears, no more pleas for reconciliation. She seemed to have accepted her role as the mother of our children, nothing more. One Friday evening, I found myself standing on the sidelines of Noah's soccer game. Jenny was there too, cheering on her son, who played on the same team. "You're getting loud," I teased as she shouted encouragement. She laughed, a warm sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Someone's got to keep them motivated." The game ended, and as the kids swarmed around us, Jenny and I fell into easy conversation. She mentioned an art exhibit opening downtown, a casual suggestion that we check it out. I hesitated. For months, I'd buried myself in work and parenting, reluctant to step into anything that felt like a date. But Jenny wasn't a stranger. She wasn't someone who needed explanations or guarded answers. "Sure," I said, surprising even myself. The exhibit was stunning, a mix of abstract pieces and vivid landscapes. But what stood out most was Jenny. The way her eyes lit up as she explained her favorite pieces, the way her laughter filled the quiet gallery, it was infectious. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about Rachel or Greg. I wasn't thinking about revenge or betrayal. I was just there, in the moment, enjoying her company. Afterward, we sat at a small cafe, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. Jenny opened up about her struggles post-divorce, her fears of starting over, and her hopes for the future. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the table. "But lately, I've realized it's not about finding it. It's about creating it." Her words resonated deeply. "You're right," I said, meeting her eyes. "Happiness isn't something that just happens. It's something we build, piece by piece." She smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost, hope. Jenny and I didn't rush things. We spent time together, blending our kids' playdates with quiet moments of connection. It wasn't the whirlwind romance of my younger years. It was something steadier, something real. Rachel noticed the shift, though she never said anything directly. Once, while picking up the kids, she lingered by the door. "I'm glad you're happy," she said softly. "Thanks," I replied, and for the first time, I meant it. By the time the holidays rolled around, Jenny and I had found a rhythm. She came over for dinner with her kids, and for the first time in years, the house felt full, not with the weight of what had been lost, but with the warmth of what was being built. After dinner, as we sat by the fire watching the kids play, Jenny reached for my hand. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked. "Sometimes," I said. "But for now, I'm just grateful for where we are." She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "Me too." The past year had been a storm, tearing through everything I thought I knew. But storms don't last forever. They clear the way for new growth, new possibilities. I wasn't the same person I'd been before Rachel's betrayal. I was scarred, yes, but also stronger, more aware of who I was and what I wanted. And as I sat there, surrounded by laughter and light, I realized something profound. The revenge, the anger, the destruction, it had been a chapter, but it wasn't the whole story. This was a new chapter, a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it. Bye.